Hi, everybody. My name is Kelsey Brown, she, her, hers. I study sociology, and this is my project. It's called Privilege and Boundary Work in Boston Party Subcultures. So this is just to get you a picture of where I'm coming from, to give everybody an idea of what these places look like and what they are. Like many freshmen of my social location at BU, I started off by partying at frats, right? Fraternities are social organizations. More often than not, they're cis men who have parties in their houses, in their basements. And in Boston, one of the neighborhoods that they're concentrated in is in Allston, and folks from all over Boston come to party there, right? So it's a big hub for young kids like us. And so here's me at frats. So I wanted to check out other party scenes, and I was told that the house show scene is also prominent in Allston. So house shows, or DIY shows, are parties where there's a live band in the basement instead of a DJ set. So where fraternities are generally connected to a school, house shows are not, but both are institutionalized in that they roll off the head when you think about college parties, and they're also like long-standing party scenes. They've been there forever in Allston, right? As you can see, they're both parties in basements. They both have neon lights, drinking. It's like a general party environment, right? So things that I noticed right away to frame my questions going in when I was there freshman year. So I noticed right away that the majority of people in both spaces were very white and affluent, right? Like this is a study of privilege, okay? They're also spatially in the same place. This is not an official research map, but does give you a picture of where these streets are. There's literally 9 streets, and all of the houses are packed into each other. And they also have the same population, right, students. And then there seemed to be a divide between house show people and frat people. And my house show friends wouldn't really talk to my frat friends, and my frat friends wouldn't really talk to my house show friends. So I thought this was sociologically interesting. I wanted to compare these scenes, right? So just some background, there is some work on these individual scenes and how they reproduce privilege. There is, they're known as privilege reproduction sites in the literature. There's no research, however, comparing fraternity parties and house shows. Therefore, this goes into privilege reproduction because it's pretty well established that, again, like these are privilege reproduction sites. And again, most students go through the Allston circuit, so it's relevant in that way as well. So my research question going in was, what are the differences and similarities between fraternity and house show cultures? How are they reproducing privilege, and what can we learn from their constructions of each other? So I did 30 semi-structured interviews, 15 with house show people and 15 with frat people. And I delineated people by folks who go to house shows or fraternities at least twice a month. I can also show you, if we have more time at the end, pie charts and tables with identity, but basically these were very privileged folks that I was interviewing. I did interview some more marginalized folks, but many of them had privilege on another axis of identity, and we'll get into how they negotiated that privilege in my discussion. I don't think these are fully representative of both scenes. Both scenes have been described to me as even more privileged, and I also got that in my ethnography. However, I got these participants because I started where I was with me and with my friends, and I convenience sampled, and from my convenience samples, I snowball sampled. And that means they chose some of their friends to recommend to me, and then it kind of snowballed from there. Regardless, it's key that I interviewed some more marginalized folks because they definitely helped corroborate my discussion and analysis. And then I also did supplementary participant observation. It was very supplementary. It was cut short because of COVID, but it did help me get some visual reference and corroborate what I was noticing and what was being said. So I found that individuals in each scene imagined strong symbolic boundaries but did not notice their similarities with each other. They noticed structural issues but did very little to address them. So these two scenes were relationally constructed along what I call the alt-normie binary. And so this language, like alt and normie, were used in both scenes very evenly and frequently. So here are some characteristics that both scenes used to describe both scenes. These terms came up sporadically, which is really important, without my prompting. And there's a lot of relational work that was done to avoid the specter of normies for alts or vice versa. sometimes they just wouldn't get let in the door if you looked like an alt and you approached a frat, or if you looked like a normie and you approached a house show. And so either alt or indie was used by 16 different participants, and basic or normie were used by 23 different participants out of my 30 interviews. So again, this was used frequently. There was a lot of maintenance of these boundaries. So we can circle back to these if we want to, but for time, I'm going to go through them fast. There's a strict social hierarchy for both scenes. There's a very similar party layout. Again, it's like the party in the basement. Both places stemmed from a lack of access, and that individuals joined so that they could have access to a party scene, but they were very exclusive to other scenes, which further pushed that symbolic divide. And there was very little diversity in both places. And in my discussion section, we'll get into how these folks navigated their privilege. So there were huge structural issues across the board. Frats were more overt about this, and house shows were more covert, but this stuff was frequent and intense in both scenes. The stories of these were told to me by some of the more marginalized folks that I interviewed. And the individuals in these scenes definitely didn't deny that there were problems with these things. However, they then maneuvered to distance themselves from these problems. And we'll get into that right now. So I came up with this equation to describe the ways that they don't see their similarities and they do not address their structural issues. So it's internalization of symbolic boundaries plus what I call privilege bargaining equals this not seeing these similarities and not addressing these like huge structural issues, right? So for the first part, internalization of symbolic boundaries, symbolic differences like ways of dressing or likes or dislikes were internalized as actual differences. So this led to pointing the finger when it came to big structural issues, right? So for house shows, they would be like, because we're different, because we're musicians, we don't have the same problems that frats do. So immediately in this first quote, when I asked him why he parties at house shows, he was like, frats are misogynistic. And fraternities would be like, because we are frats and we have this like masculine militarized hierarchy thing, we run a tight ship, right? And so house shows or other parties are loose. And so that's also like pulling on these symbolic things. And then the second part of that equation is privilege bargaining, right? And so I found that individuals would maneuver to bargain down their privilege. And so this comes from literature on bargaining axes of identity in general. So in Chen's work, individuals would bargain up and emphasize certain parts of their identity to achieve masculinity. I argue that they're bargaining down their privilege, right? So this is in direct response, I argue, to contentious politics, which is a political strategy that says you should be uncomfortable with your privilege. So this is a way to maneuver around that and sit comfortably within privilege. And it's interesting because it's the use of this political strategy in a space that is traditionally conceived of as apolitical. So here are some examples. In the first one, a frat bro was talking about how they're super diverse because they have folks that are from England rushing. And we don't know the social locations of these people from England. However, that doesn't necessarily make them diverse. And in the second one, it's a house show person that is saying, because there are folks with many music interests, we are super diverse. So again, it's like claiming diversity by bargaining down one's privilege, by claiming a less privileged position. So future directions, I would like to delineate bargaining strategies. Looking at it again, I think it's not just minimizing one's privilege, but deflecting and also like pointing to taste. And this is also, the first comparative work with frats and house shows. I do think it would be salient to compare them in other places. My participants were telling me about house show scenes in Atlanta as well and in Philly and how they're different from Boston scenes, so that would also be interesting. And of course, there were other threads that I explore in my paper that I didn't focus on as much that I think could be developed into more papers because it was a huge body of data that I got. So yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah.
Questions?
Yes.
First, congrats, Kels. Amazing project. I guess I was just wondering about this bargaining down strategy for privilege. obviously in Boston, it is a very different community, different environment than some other places in the United States. Do you think that in fraternity culture versus house show, in different areas, that same strategy of bargaining down would be holding up potentially? I don't know if you encounter that at all in literature. Bargaining down privilege.
So bargaining down also in other spaces?
Yeah, in different spaces, in different regions.
I think definitely,
Yeah.
yeah. I think privilege bargaining, again, it's like it's a response to a political movement, and it's a political strategy. So I think it's used across many scenes, across many subcultures and scenes, and individually as well, yeah.
You mentioned a few times this phrase, reproducing privilege. Can you explain what that actually means?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, it's sociology. But in these sites, they're almost socialized into their social location, right? So that's through things like Bourdieu and Lamont often cite like taste, right? So, you know, fraternities will be like, we like boat shoes here, you know, we do that. And that, you know, right, that denotes a specific social location, a specific class. So it's almost like reproducing one's class status through culture.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'll keep it short. I'm just curious. Do you identify as one or the other, or as both?
No,
Okay,
I
cool.
don't. Yeah, I'm not.
Given the brevity of that question, we can squeeze one more.
Hi, you mentioned Boston as being this very unique place. How do you see your research as grounded in the kind of geographic, geospatial identity of Boston as being this melange of different colleges, different populations of students, and do you think your results would be repeated in other locations where fraternities are, say, on campus land, or where there is less kind of different options, different ways to express or find party scenes?
Yeah. Well, for me, I don't know if it would be reproduced in other sites. For me, it was less about the example and more about the findings of bargaining down privilege, right? And also like internalization of symbolic boundaries. I think that those things are reproduced across the nation, right? But this specific site was a really great breeding ground for that, and I was very lucky in that. And that's why I wanted to study it, because it was geographically so packed in. And I could tell these cultures were kind of relationally constructed.